There's a specific kind of tedium to digitizing 20 years of school fundraiser photos, the kind where your eyes glaze over so completely that you start recognizing people by the shape of their haircuts instead of their faces. That's a bake sale banner from 2007. That's the year the gym flooded and everyone had to hold the spring carnival in the parking lot instead. That's definitely someone's uncle in a dunk tank. He clearly regretted volunteering for waterlogged and furious in 3 separate photos taken from 3 separate angles. The PDA had inherited 4 cardboard boxes of loose, unsorted photos when the last archive volunteer moved to Arizona, and somehow, in the specific way volunteer work always seems to find its way to whoever's foolish enough to mention they wouldn't mind helping out sometime, I'd become the person scanning them all into a shared drive 1 box at a time. I was 3 hours into a Tuesday night of this, cross-legged on my living room floor with a scanner humming beside me and a bowl of pretzels going stale in my lap, my daughter Maya long since asleep down the hall, when a piece of paper slid out from between 2 photo sleeves that didn't belong in the box at all. Thinner, older, folded in quarters instead of loose like everything else. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed at the folds so deeply the creases had gone almost translucent, clearly decades older than anything else in that archive, by at least a generation. A missing person's notice, and the face looking out from that grainy 20-year-old newsprint photo stopped my hand completely, pretzel halfway to my mouth, because I was looking impossibly, unmistakably, at my daughter's 3rd grade teacher. 20 years younger, hair longer, a version of a face I saw at pickup nearly every single afternoon. Under a name I had never once heard anyone call him. I want to tell you up front that this isn't the story you're probably bracing for. I know how these things usually go, the shape true stories like this usually take, and I spent a solid 2 weeks genuinely afraid I was about to uncover something that would end with police involvement and a very different kind of video than the one you're watching right now. It doesn't end that way. I need you to sit with that uncertainty a little while I did, though, because I certainly didn't know the ending yet when I was sitting on my living room floor at 11 at night with a stale pretzel in my hand and a name, Thomas Whitlow. That meant absolutely nothing to me. Staring back from newsprint at a face I saw at pickup every single afternoon. I told myself it was a coincidence for exactly 1 day. People have doppelgangers. Photocopied newsprint from the early 2000s is grainy and unreliable and does strange things to a face, flattens features, exaggerates shadows in ways a modern photo never would. I put the clipping in a drawer in my desk, tucked under a stack of expired coupons, and went about my life, packed lunches, signed a field trip form for the aquarium, chatted with Mr. Ferris at pickup the very next afternoon about how Maya had finally, after months of flat resistance, started actually enjoying reading because of some elaborate reward chart system he'd built involving stickers shaped like dinosaurs. A different species for each reading milestone, a full-color Tyrannosaurus, reserved for finishing an entire chapter book on her own. He was, by every account, wonderful with kids, patient in a way that seemed to cost him actual visible effort some afternoons, crouching down to Maya's exact eye level to talk about a book she'd half abandoned, the kind of patience you can tell is a skill somebody built on purpose, brick by brick, rather than something they were simply born already possessing. But I couldn't let it go, and I want to be honest about why. Because it wasn't noble curiosity. It was the specific, itchy, slightly shameful kind of curiosity that makes you keep scratching at something you already suspect you shouldn't touch. I found myself, 3 nights later, back on the living room floor with my laptop instead of the scanner, cross-referencing that decades-old missing persons photo against every angle of Mr. Ferris's face I could find in the school's newsletter archive, tilting my own head the same way in a dark hallway mirror, trying to convince myself the resemblance was coincidental. It wasn't. The ears alone convinced me a specific slight asymmetry. Higher on the left, the kind of detail you'd never fake and would never notice unless you were already looking obsessively hard for it. I told my husband Paul over dinner that same week, pushing rice around my plate more than actually eating it, and I watched his face do the thing it does when he shifts fully into what I affectionately, and sometimes not so affectionately, call his deposition voice. Paul is a contracts lawyer, and Paul does not, generally, enjoy ambiguity of any kind. He alphabetizes the spice rack, and once made us return a rental car 40 minutes early to avoid any possible dispute. You need to tell the school, he said, almost before I'd finished the sentence, setting down his fork with the particular deliberateness of a man building a case. Renee, if this man is teaching under a false identity, that's a background check that failed somewhere. That's a liability issue for every family in that building, including ours, including Maya. I don't think he's dangerous, I said, and I heard how thin that sounded even as I said it, propped up on nothing but a gut feeling and a sticker chart shaped like dinosaurs. You don't know that, Paul said, not unkindly, just with the specific flatness of a man who spends his working life assuming the worst case scenario because someone, professionally, has to. Nobody fakes an identity for a good reason, statistically speaking. I didn't report it that week. I know that probably sounds reckless, laid out plainly like that, and Paul certainly thought so at the time, bringing it up twice more over the following days in the careful, circling way he does when he's decided not to push, but hasn't actually let it go. But something in me wanted to actually understand the shape of it before I potentially detonated a man's entire adult life over a hunch and an old newspaper clipping pulled from between two photo sleeves by pure accident. So I kept digging in the particular late night, slightly guilty way you dig into something you've half convinced yourself is research and half know is closer to surveillance, laptop balanced on my knees long after Paul had gone to bed. The original missing persons case turned out to be almost eerily undramatic once I found the full archived article. Buried 4 pages deep in a newspaper's digital archive, I had to pay $11 to access for a month. Thomas Whitlow, 24 years old at the time, reported missing by his own father. No signs of foul play, no forced entry at his apartment, no withdrawn savings suggesting foul play in either direction. Closed, 18 months later, as a voluntary disappearance, an adult man who had simply, deliberately, chosen to vanish from his own life, with zero criminal element attached to the case file at all, according to a brief follow-up article marking the case's official closure. That detail alone reshaped the whole shape of my fear, sitting there at my kitchen table at nearly midnight. This wasn't someone running from consequences in the way Paul's worst-case scenario brain had assumed. This was someone running from something else entirely, and I genuinely didn't know yet what that something was. I found the something else a few nights later, buried in a local newspaper archive from the small town he'd apparently grown up in, a town I'd never heard of 2 states away. Population small enough that the paper still ran a weekly who's who column about local sports teams. 8 months before he vanished, 23-year-old Thomas Whitlow had been publicly accused, in that same small local paper, of stealing from the hardware store where he worked stocking shelves and running the register on weekends. The accusation ran with his full name, his yearbook-style photo, his employer's furious quote calling him a disappointment to everyone who trusted him, printed above the fold on a slow news week where apparently nothing else warranted the front page. A retraction ran 4 months later, buried on page 11 next to a classified ad for a used tractor, 3 sentences long, admitting the accounting error had actually been the manager's own mistake, a decimal point in the wrong place on a monthly inventory sheet. 3 sentences, undoing a front-page accusation nobody in that small town had likely even seen retracted, because who reads page 11 of a paper that thin? I sat with that for a long time at my kitchen table, laptop glow the only light in the room, feeling something shift in my chest from suspicion into something much closer to grief for a total stranger I'd never actually spoken a word to under his real name. I found one more piece before I worked up the nerve to actually talk to him, an old public social media post from someone who'd apparently gone to high school with Thomas Whitlow, reminiscing years later in a whatever happened to nostalgia thread about poor Tommy, describing his father in a single unguarded sentence as the strictest, coldest man I ever met, God rest him, and mentioning, almost as an aside buried in a longer comment about a different classmate entirely, that Tommy had some kind of breakdown right around the same time he disappeared. Nobody in that thread seemed to know where he'd gone. Nobody apparently had ever really looked that hard, and reading it I felt a strange, protective anger on behalf of a man I'd only known up to that point as somebody who was very good at teaching 3rd graders to love reading. I requested a private meeting with Mr. Ferris after school on a Thursday, my hands sweating so badly through the whole conversation with the front office that I had to wipe them on my jeans twice before I even sat down in the little chair across from his desk, the same low, brightly colored plastic chair Maya sits in during parent conferences, comically small, making me feel like an oversized intruder in a room built for 8-year-olds. My knees nearly at my chin. His classroom smelled like the particular mix every elementary classroom seems to share: pencil shavings and hand sanitizer and something faintly like the inside of a library book. And there was a half-finished bulletin board behind his desk, construction paper dinosaurs in various stages of being cut out, presumably for next week's reading milestone. I showed him the clipping, sliding it across the desk between us without saying much at first, letting him find it himself the way I had. I watched every drop of color leave his face in real time, watched his hand actually grip the edge of his desk, like the floor had tilted underneath him, one of the construction paper dinosaurs slipping off the desk and drifting to the floor between us, neither of us moving to pick it up. "Where did you get this?" he said, and his voice had gone somewhere small and frightened I'd never heard from him before. Not once. Not through an entire year of confident classroom management and dinosaur stickers and calm, patient redirections of 8-year-olds mid-meltdown. "A box of old fundraiser photos," I said. I wasn't looking for anything. It was just there, mixed in by accident, I think. He was quiet for what felt like a genuinely long time, staring at the desk between us, one hand still resting on its edge like he needed the anchor, and when he finally spoke, it came out in fragments, like a man handing over pieces of something he'd spent 15 years carefully not looking at directly himself, not even alone, not even at 3 in the morning. Thomas Whitlow, he told me, hadn't run from a crime. He'd run from a father who'd made his entire childhood and young adulthood a kind of low, constant siege, controlling, coldly critical, the specific brand of parental cruelty that doesn't leave visible marks, but leaves everything else slightly bent out of shape. The kind you don't fully recognize as cruelty until you're standing far enough outside it to see the whole shape at once. The theft accusation had been the final blow to a reputation his father had already spent years quietly undermining in that small, tightly knit town, needling neighbors and co-workers with comments dressed up as concern, and in the aftermath, alone, humiliated, and increasingly unwell in ways he said he still didn't have complete language for even now. 24-year-old Thomas had simply, one ordinary Tuesday, gotten on a bus with almost nothing and not gotten off again anywhere near home. "I didn't fake anything illegal," he said, some of the color coming back into his face now. Like the act of finally saying it out loud, after 15 years, was its own kind of relief. "I'd built a whole life under a name I chose for myself, quietly, unofficially, for a few rough years while I figured out how to even function again. I made it fully legal eventually, once I'd stabilized new documents, an actual court process, everything real and above board. I've had a legitimate legal name for over a decade now. Daniel Ferris is who I actually legally am. It's just those first few years, before I made it official, I'm still a little afraid of." I told Paul everything that night, and he was quiet for longer than I expected, turning his wine glass slowly by the stem. "That's not what I was picturing," he finally admitted. "I still think the school needs to know. Not to punish him, but because if this surfaces some other way years from now, it looks 100 times worse for everyone if the school didn't know first." I agreed with him, which surprised me a little, and so did Daniel once I brought the idea back to him, not as a threat, but as an offer. He wanted to be the one to tell Principal Ortiz himself, on his own terms, rather than have it arrive as some kind of ambush. Principal Ortiz, to her considerable credit, handled it with a level head I genuinely didn't expect from a Tuesday afternoon meeting that started with Daniel saying, visibly shaking, "There's something sensitive I need to discuss with you, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." She listened for nearly 45 minutes without interrupting once, according to Daniel, taking notes on a legal pad the way Paul might have, and then she pulled his actual, current legal documentation on the spot. His teaching license, his background check paperwork, his court-ordered name change certificate, laid out across her desk like puzzle pieces finally being fit together correctly for the first time. Everything checked out completely under his real, current legal name. His license was valid. His background check, run under Daniel Ferris, had never been false in any technical sense at all. She made the quiet, sensible call. after a full day of considering it, that there was no safety concern to disclose to other families, because there genuinely wasn't one, just a private history that belonged to him, and now, to a small handful of people he trusted enough to finally tell. The last piece of this whole strange unraveling happened almost by accident, the way the first piece had. I found, doing one more late night search I told myself was the absolute last one, a woman named Claire Whitlow on a professional networking site. Same unusual last name, roughly the right age to be a sister, a small resemblance around the eyes I only noticed because I'd spent weeks by then studying that specific face. I sent one careful, deliberately vague message, heart pounding as I hit send, half convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. And it turned out she'd spent close to 2 decades wondering, in her own words when she finally wrote back 3 days later, if my brother was even alive somewhere, and hating myself a little every year for not looking harder. Their reconnection, when it finally happened months later over an achingly awkward first phone call I wasn't part of but heard about afterward in careful pieces from Daniel, wasn't some tidy movie ending, no tearful airport reunion, nothing like that. It was 2 adults in their 40s who'd missed almost 20 years of each other's ordinary lives, cautiously, slowly, over several more calls, and eventually one hesitant weekend visit, figuring out what was even left standing to rebuild. I think about that stale bowl of pretzels sometimes, oddly, more than almost any other detail from that whole strange month. I went looking, half by accident and half by a curiosity I'm still not entirely proud of, for a stranger hiding in plain sight in my daughter's classroom. I found a man who had finally, quietly, after 15 careful years, become exactly the person he was always supposed to be.